webinar for the Pittsburgh Human Resources Association that USI is doing this year for 2018. This is the third in the series. We're actually going to continue the series in 2019. We've got another one coming up in January. Really excited about today's presentation. We've got two experts on employment law and human resources to have a discussion around kind of the latest trends, not only in managing PTO, but really the future of work. And we want to have a discussion today about just the mobility of the workforce and some of the changes that we're seeing. And so today we've got myself, Mike Baker, with USI, Mary Good, who is the Chief Human Resources Officer for Fuse, and Faith Whitaker, who is an employment attorney with Dinsmore. Mary and I have had the good fortune to work together in the past. Found her to be one of the leading HR minds in the space, and I think everyone's going to enjoy what she has to say today about some of the findings they've got at Fuse around the future of work and just the mobility of the workforce. And then, of course, we all have to worry about compliance and what that looks like. And so we're going to turn it over to Faith after that to talk a little bit around some things that you should be thinking about from a compliance standpoint. And then we'll go ahead and go into Q&A. So if anyone's got a question as we're going along here, please feel free to just put that in the chat box. And then when we finish up, I'll go ahead and ask those questions back to the panelists. So with that, a little background on USI. We're a large middle market broker here in the United States, 6,000 employees, 150 different offices across the country, about $2 billion in revenue, and we were rated one of America's best large employers this year, which we're really excited about. So I'll now hand it over to Mary to talk a little bit about Fuse and where they see some trends going in the workforce of the future. Mary?
That's great. Hey, thanks, Mike. So greetings, everybody, from the Tech Hub of Boston. I've been the Chief People Officer here at Fuse for just a little over 2 years now, and it's been quite an exciting ride. Let's go to the first slide, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the company, because I think that puts this in context in terms of why I'm talking about the future of work. I've been the head of HR for, I guess this is my 6th company, and this one is a really interesting technology company. We have about 700 employees. We are doing something called Unified Communications as a Service. So if you think about all of the different ways that your employees communicate with each other, with customers, et cetera, they're using their smartphones. They may be in a conference room doing audio or video. They're using chat and texting. They may be using their laptop computers. Some people no longer even have a desk phone. In fact, I haven't had a desk phone in a couple of years now. So what our technology does is really pulls together all of those different communications vehicles into one seamless platform. And so we're kind of on the cutting edge of progressive, really disruptive technologies, and we provide all of this communication through a cloud-based platform. And so having now been here 2 years, obviously we're using the platform ourselves, and it has really transformed the way that we work. And what I thought I would share with you today is a little bit about a study that we just recently did looking at the future of work. And so go to the next slide, Mike. I'll introduce this. This is a brand new report, and we surveyed more than 6,600 workers across 9 countries, so the major countries in Europe, Asia, obviously the U.S., Canada. And we found that there were really 3 trends. And I think for all of us in HR, you know, what I'm going to say is not going to be anything earth-shattering, because I suspect you all are wrestling with these issues in your own workplaces in the same way that I have over the last number of years. The first key trend is work as a service, and I'll get more into that The second trend is work as your office. And the third trend is the employ me. And you can easily download a copy of the report. It's free by going to that site there. And you can also check out fees if you're interested. So let's go to the first slide here in the report. And I guess what I would say at a high level is the demographics are changing. We all know that the workforce is not what it was even 5 or 10 years ago. I can remember when I was first coming out of school, and I'll date myself, you know, everyone came to work every day. People wore suits and ties. People were expected to be at their desk. If you wanted to take a day of vacation, you had to put in a request for that. And then we started to see things change. We started to see casual Friday. Anybody remember that? Casual Friday dress. Then business casual. You know, then you saw so many of the automations of technology tools and voicemail and email and internet. And where we are now is a real far cry from that. But it used to be that way back when, for those of us who are boomers, you know, you'd have a telephone. And if you wanted to call somebody and you couldn't reach them, or they'd call you back and you'd get the little pink slip that said, well, you were out, and you would play phone tag like that sometimes for weeks. You know, the current workers, the Gen X workers, they then, you know, brought in place the faxes and PCs and pens, electronic pens. We also now have email and SMS, text messaging, laptops, and smartphones. And think about how much you can now do on your smartphone, ordering from Amazon Prime and getting your packages shipped within one day. There's just been an incredible technology shift. And along with that technology shift, you've had these 5 generations in the workplace kind of all coming together with different expectations. So as we're rolling out our own platform, we're going into workplaces where we have people in their 60s and 70s who can't imagine not having a telephone at their desk. And then we look at our current workers who are in their early to mid-20s, and they don't even know how to use a telephone. That's not something that's, you know, a regular dial phone is not something that they're as familiar with as their smartphone. And when you see in terms of the technology of choice where we're actually going with that, in the future, you're going to have smartphones, tablets, apps, and video. So even email is being displaced by chat and by text. And so over time, some of these older technologies will just not even exist anymore. And what's also interesting about this is that different people of different generations have a preference for those methodologies. When I go into a meeting now, and most of the folks are in their 20s and 30s, I think our average age is about 31, I'm the only one in there with a piece of note paper and a pen. They almost exclusively use their laptops or their phones to do all of their communications and all of their note-taking. So if you think about it from an HR perspective, what an incredible opportunity, but also a real challenge to make sure that your tools and how you're communicating works for everyone in your organization. And you can see how this has evolved. Expectations have really changed over time. The other thing that's interesting about this, because of the way things have changed, is you also see real estate and facilities becoming a new form of employee engagement. So because you don't need to be sitting at a desk or tied to a phone or tied to a laptop, you can really work from anywhere, and that gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility. So the first trend that we're really seeing is work as a service. So the flexible work arrangements that used to be the kind of thing that was policy-driven is now becoming a way of life for most people. And many folks would prefer to have a job that has no set hours, called the project economy. So that's, you see some of the results of this study. And the appeal from working from anywhere is also something that we see as a trend. So interesting challenges for HR folks from the standpoint of how do you provide these kinds of flexible arrangements when maybe your baby boomers are used to having people sitting in an office and used to having people where they can look at them and see are they there and how are they being productive, versus the folks that are working from home, working from anywhere, not having set hours. It requires different management and leadership skills. So let's go to the next slide. The second trend is the world is your office. So this is the notion that people want to have flexibility in terms of where they're working from. What's interesting is 79% of workers would include working from a company office. So I think this notion that we're going to see people just having no workplace and everybody working from home or from the local Starbucks, I think that's not realistic. I think employees like to be engaged. They want to feel like they're part of a team. The technology tools that we have help to engage people, but there's nothing like sitting next to somebody and having a chat. And so you can see that as it was resulting in this answer on this survey. But you also see only 20% want to work from the office every working day. In our big cities, part of that's due to the long commute hours, the cost of commuting, the need for some more flexibility. And then if you think about people in rural populations or suburban populations, they have different challenges. If you're a remote worker and you can work from anywhere, the world opens up many new opportunities to you. And as a company that can recruit people who can work from anywhere, my pipeline of talent has just increased immensely because I'm not requiring somebody to be in an office. So the world is your office, and the flexibility around where people work from has become something that employees are demanding. So let's go to the next slide. We're doing some experimenting in terms of our own space. So I'm sure many of you probably already have this. You know, you don't have assigned seating. You have people just plopping down wherever there's a space. This photo up here on the right is our New York office. And you can see that the trend is moving in that direction. However, people really still need quiet space. They need cubby space. They need space for collaboration. And so real estate and workplace design is also going hand in hand with this workforce of the future, where there's just a tremendous amount of flexibility built in large part because of the technology tools and how they have improved people's ability to communicate across global boundaries. Next slide, please. So this is the third trend, which is the employ me. And this really speaks to how employees see the effect of automation. And what's interesting, you would have thought that this would have been kind of a scarier thing, and maybe that's reflecting my own baby boomer generation viewpoint, but you see more than half of the folks are not so worried about the impact of automation. They actually think that machines can help people to be more productive and free folks up to do more important kinds of work. So while we thought it was kind of scary introducing a lot of these new tools, the tools have actually been well received by employees. And that was not something that I would have necessarily expected. So I'd like to end by showing you one slide that really talks about a future. And this is a slide that we use when we're doing sales meetings and customer meetings. But these technology tools and on the communications end can really help folks to better diagnose and understand what's happening in their own organization. So you can look at this and you can see what are the communications patterns of how offices and people are working together. You can identify where experts are in your organization based on the volume of traffic going to and from those individuals. You can also see who is overloaded. So if you see so many demands going into one person, you can spot burnout. And you can also look for patterns of engagement and high performance. So if you had, you took all of your high potential employees and you looked at their patterns of communication, you could probably identify the secret sauce to how you would onboard somebody and who people would need to talk to from an onboarding perspective to be able to ramp up quickly. So this is where the data and analytics are coming into play with respect to the future of the workforce. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to think about from an HR standpoint is as these tools become even more sophisticated and robust, our ability to use the tools to really drive our own thinking and understanding of our workforce will be significant. So let me end there. I wanted to give you just some food for thought in a few quick minutes. And I would say in summary, work is becoming fluid, open, balanced, and personalized. And so this notion of flexibility, the use of tools to help make your workplace more flexible, to create an individualized approach to your work that is based on what you need, is going to be a key tool in attracting and retaining talent. And workforces that see that they've got these 5 generations where they have to really manage to different kinds of audiences and employee groups at the same time attracting the next generation of talent are all adapting these highly engaging tools, but also highly engaging workplaces where there is a lot of flexibility built in. So, Mike, let me end there and just take a pause.
Yeah, Mary, I appreciate that. That was great. Super information. We're getting a few questions in, but I'll hold those to the end and hand it off to Faith now. Faith, you ready to kind of talk about some of the legal implications of this?
I am. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Faith Whitaker. I am a partner with Dinsmore. I practice exclusively labor and employment defense. We represent companies and management in all areas of employment law, whether that's the discrimination defense of claims or wage and hour, class action work. We have about 650 lawyers spread across, I think now, 24 offices. I am out of the Cincinnati, Ohio office, and we also have a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania office. But my practice has been really neat because I've been able to represent clients all over the nation, and we have a very nationwide practice as far as getting admitted into various cases depending on the issue, and I really love it. So unfortunately, there are some legal implications. With anything positive, there's going to be some negatives, and we talked about some of the benefits from working at home. There's the work-life balance component. It removes the stress of commuting, giving people more time to spend with their families or on personal needs, and helps parents continue to work while raising children. More productivity with that flexibility also. And then less turnover is the goal. It's a willingness to recruit remote workers can expand the potential talent pool. And then also with the benefit of flexibility, we can have more people wanting to stay because they have that flexibility to be able to do other things and get their work done. With those positive aspects, there's going to be some things that we just want to consider. It's not going to be applicable in every scenario, and it's just things to kind of put in the back of your head when someone is remotely working or requesting an accommodation to work from home, and that's the health and safety component, whether there's an injury during the course of working at home. There's going to be some wage and hour things to think about. Are we paying the person properly for all the hours worked, particularly for non-exempt? Also, there could be some discrimination issues, mainly the Americans with Disabilities Act. There could be an accommodation issue come up relating to remote working. And then finally, there's some security and other compliance issues that we need to think about when we're having our workers work from home or remotely. The first thing to talk about, and Mike, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, is whether the home office is safe. We don't have the control over someone's home office, certainly. So that's going to bring up some issues of safety. And, is there sufficient lighting and ventilation at the office? Are there exposed extension cords? Are there smoke detectors and fire extinguishers available where the employee would need them? And so there's also should be a designated area for somebody to work. I think at the very least, if somebody's going to be remotely working, we should take a picture of that office to show what it looks like for our records, and make sure everything seems to be safe as far as what we just talked about, the questions you might ask with lighting and ventilation. I would also recommend putting together either a memorandum of understanding or some sort of agreement that outlines the parameters of this remote working. It might help in the event that there is an injury and there's a workers' comp claim following the injury. So there's a couple cases I thought were interesting on this point. One from Pennsylvania, where an employee worked from home 3 days a week. And this case is called Verizon, Pennsylvania versus Workers' Comp Appeal Board. And while taking a break from work, this employee received a work-related phone call, and there was an urgent matter, so she started hurrying down her stairs and unfortunately fell. And due to the injuries from the fall, she required surgery on her neck that caused permanent visible scars, and so she sought disfigurement benefits through the Workers' Compensation Act in Pennsylvania. And if you have And the appeal board found that the employee was engaged in furthering the employer's business at the time that she was injured, because even though she was on a break from work, she still received that work call and then engaged in work activity. There's another interesting case. This one's out of Georgia, but you can see where the issues come up with someone working from home. This plaintiff employee was a 24-hour on-call field nurse. She fell and injured her ankle in her driveway after arriving home. On her way home, she had picked up a pizza for her family, and when she fell, she was carrying the pizza, patient reports, a work pager, and a work cell phone. And she filed for workers' compensation benefits, and the employer contested the claim, saying that the injury did not arise out of the course and scope of her employment. And the court found in favor of the employee because even though she had the pizza and picked it up on the way home, there was evidence that she had resumed the work when she fell because she was carrying those other work-related items. So it's just something to think about, is that there could be potential workers' compensation concerns as well. With wage and hour, it's primarily going to be something that we think about for non-exempt, where someone's hourly worker, we need to track the time. But while that flexibility is an attractive feature, we need to make sure that the hours and schedules are clearly defined between the employer and the employee, and ensure that the employee is getting compensated for all hours worked. Also, we need to be cognizant not just of the Fair Labor Standards Act, but also state laws that maybe govern rest and meal breaks that we need to think about, and so that we're still in compliance there. Another aspect of the wage and hour concerns is accrual for benefits, and this is really relating to a lot of the PTO. Is very state-specific and local-specific, as you know, but most of the jurisdictions that we deal with, they require that the employer follow their policy and practice. And so if you've got a policy and practice of accruing and earning PTO, whether that's vacation, sick, or you have a policy that just does not define it and just has paid time off in general, we need to be sure that we're following those accruals for the people that are working remotely. We wouldn't want them to, not be earning the requisite hours that they need. Another big piece of this, though, is the Family Medical Leave Act. And I don't know if all of you are covered employers under the Act, but it's something to certainly think about. First, with eligibility for an employee, as most of you probably know, the employee to be eligible for FMLA will have needed to work for at least 12 months and 1,250 hours. Therefore, that's why it's important to track the hours and make sure we understand that the employee is working those to be eligible. Another thing to think about is to be a covered employer under the FMLA. The employee must have worked at a location within 75 miles of a work site that employs at least 50 employees at the time of seeking leave. And so if somebody's working remotely very far away, he or she still may be eligible, and you still may be a covered employer if he or she is in that 75-mile radius. Also, there's some case law, depending on, again, the jurisdiction, but that even if the employee is outside of that 75-mile radius where there are 50 or more employees, that you could still be a covered employer if that employee reports back to a supervisor at a office with 50 or more employees and has active phone calls and meetings during the day and kind of can relate back to that home office. I had this come up actually in a case, and we did not end up winning that argument because of this lady had meetings every single day with her supervisor who was working out of the corporate office that had thousands of employees, and so they kind of connected her with those other employees. Another case, just to bring up an example of how these things can happen, this is from the Third Circuit in 2009. But the plaintiff, it's called Erdman Nationwide Insurance. The plaintiff went from full-time to part-time to care for her daughter, and as a full-time exempt employee, she worked 40 hours per week. But when she transitioned to part-time, her supervisor told her to work her approved hours and nothing more because she was non-exempt now. As a part-time employee, she continued to work comp time according to the employer's policy, which is extra hours for earning her vacation time. After she requested FMLA leave, the employer fired the plaintiff, citing behavioral issues, and she ended up suing for retaliation under the FMLA and argued that the employer argued that she did not work enough to be eligible for FMLA leave. The court found that the employer should have known of plaintiff's hours working from home, and although it did not authorize the hours, that the employer should have known that she was working her comp time, which counted toward her FMLA eligibility. So you can kind of see where we can get into some problems if we're not really taking into consideration the accrual for those remote workers. What does the ADA have to do with this? The Americans with Disabilities Act, we are seeing more and more requests for accommodations to work remotely as a reasonable accommodation. And it's really something that has blossomed up lately and something to really consider when it comes up. Instead of just saying, no, we all need to expect you in the office, that's not going to fly anymore. We really need to go through that interactive process and determine whether or not it would be a reasonable accommodation. And just to kind of touch base on that standard, while it's the employee's burden to prove disability discrimination, it would actually be our burden to show that providing the accommodation would cause an undue hardship or pose a direct threat of harm. And the undue hardship argument must be based on an individualized assessment of current circumstances that show that a specific reasonable accommodation would cause that significant duty or expense. And it's based on several factors according to the EEOC guidance. And not one factor will be determinative, but it's really a situational basis. But some of the factors that the EEOC looks at is the nature and cost of the accommodation needed, the overall financial resources of the facility making the reasonable accommodation, the overall financial resources, size, number of employees, and type and location of the facilities, the type of operation of the employer, including the structure and functions of the workforce, the geographic separateness, and the administrative or fiscal relationship of the facility involved in making the accommodation, and the impact of the accommodation on the operation of the facility. So there's a lot of things at play in looking at whether or not that accommodation would be reasonable, and I'm looking at, whether teleworking is going to be reasonable in these circumstances. There's a very recent case from the Sixth Circuit that's on this issue of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's Mosby Meekum versus Memphis Light. And plaintiff was actually an in-house attorney who practiced in labor and employment law, which I thought was interesting. That they still took her on, even though she probably, I would imagine, knew her rights certainly in this area. But she worked for a public utility company. And in 2011, the general counsel distributed a memo to all in-house lawyers instructing them to be in the office from 8:30 until 5 to, quote, set a good example for the support staff, end quote. There was no other formal telecommuting policy, and in practice, employees often worked from home or worked remotely somewhere. And so that was it, just that memo. The plaintiff was hospitalized due to pregnancy complications. She had had a very large amount of miscarriages before and a history of miscarriages, and the doctor of this pregnancy put her on a modified bed rest for 10 weeks. Therefore, she sought an accommodation to work from home and in her bed at home for 10 weeks. The employer, in response, formed an ADA committee, had a conference call with the plaintiff and asked her whether or not she could do all of her duties from bed, and went through her job description, and she indicated she could, but they still denied the request and said that physical presence at the office was an essential function of the job. Also, the employer said that her teleworking would create concerns about maintaining confidentiality. But interestingly, the plaintiff had already worked remotely 3 weeks during this time without any objection, and while the request was pending. She sued as a current employee, so they didn't fire her or anything. She sued as a current employee for disability and pregnancy discrimination, but with respect to the disabilities, what we're looking at here, She won at trial, and the jury awarded her $92,000 for compensation for compensatory damages, and then $18,000 in lost pay. So the district court denied any post-trial motions, and the Sixth Circuit actually affirmed this. So what the court said was that there was no dispute that the plaintiff had actually ever tried any cases or interviewed or deposed witnesses, that she farmed all of that out to outside counsel, so she didn't actually do any of the things that they were saying she may need to do, and that the job description was more than 20 years old, and it wasn't up to date in really what she even did. And then several coworkers actually testified that she could perform all the essential functions during that 10-week period from home or remotely. So it's just something to be aware of if we're going to just have a blanket statement of no, we won't allow anyone to work from home, that could be problematic from an ADA standpoint. Another case of reasonable accommodation is Bisker versus GGS Informational Services. It's a middle of District of Pennsylvania case. The employee suffered from MS, and because of her condition, she sought an accommodation to work from home. The employer said that the request was unreasonable because she was expected to interact with other employees in the office in order to meet tight deadlines. The court denied the employer's motion for summary judgment, which was they were trying to dismiss the case, because the employer could not demonstrate why it would create an undue burden, and i.e. why the employee could not do her work and meet the deadlines at home. So outside of the ADA, there's also, as we already had talked about a little bit, FMLA implications. There's another case that's illustrative of this issue. It's Holmberg versus UPS, and it's a Kansas case. But the plaintiff regularly worked from both the home and the employer's office, and she used FMLA to give birth, and then after she returned from her leave, she wanted to work from home mostly as an accommodation to continue nursing, and the employer allowed it. When other employees started to complain that the plaintiff was working from home too, the employer denied the request anymore and told the employee that she could no longer work from home. And when she said she was still going to work from home, the employer fired her, and she sued for FMLA retaliation. The court found that it was plausible that the employer had retaliated based on the timing of her termination because it was shortly after her leave. So it gets into the reason I like this case is because, ADA is very specific to that employee and what's going on with that employee. And I know we need to, of course, be cognizant of other employees that are in the workforce. It's really on an individualized basis, and those other employees don't have a right to know the medical needs of certain employees. And so it's just something to think about of, not just because other employees complain, it doesn't mean you need to not provide that reasonable accommodation to that employee if it makes sense in that case. Outside of those concerns, there are also some proprietary and confidential information concerns that we need to protect. And Mike, if you wouldn't mind getting to the next slide, please. So admittedly, this cybersecurity area is not my area. Thankfully, we have people in our firm that I ask when these come up. But I had tapped some of them, then told them I was doing this and wanted to get their take on what would be the best thing to do for people who are working remotely and some guidance here. Because, of course, working outside of the office is going to compromise the security of the organization. Some risks are hackers who are going to attempt to corrupt the files of the organization, or people who are really trying to find out company secrets or proprietary trade information. So from employer standpoint, there's plenty of best practices that we can do. The first thing is really to create remote working policies and procedures that cover the use of devices and have a clear understanding of what is allowed. And, of course, providing the workers with the approved tools and devices is also important. And maybe there's a policy that bans personal web browsing on or emailing with a personal account on work computers. Another good thing to do is to enforce data encryption on all devices and only allow approved devices to connect to company networks. Use VPN to secure all web traffic flowing through your network by encrypting it and routing it to an intermediary server. And enforce a two-factor authentication to control access to the company system. Another good piece of advice is to use strong cryptic passwords on all of the work and personal accounts and resist the urge to duplicate passwords. And that is something that we would put in a policy, I would imagine. And then always make sure that the devices and software have the most up-to-date versions to help safeguard that information. Finally, another thing to consider when the employees are working remotely is posting requirements. A lot of states and, of course, the federal laws require a number of different posters. And so, of course, what do we do when someone's not even going into the office on a regular basis? And we just have to make sure that we are giving these employees copies of the posters, whether that's through email or through the company intranet, and making sure that he or she acknowledges receipt of those posters. Some examples are in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania minimum wage poster, equal pay law, workers' compensation posters, unemployment. And then from a federal requirement, there's the EEO, the USERA, the minimum wage under the FLSA poster, talking about deductions and exempt status, and then also under FMLA, there's certain posters. So it's just something to think about to make sure that those employees are also receiving the required notice. And with that, I think I've covered, just some of the issue-spotting things to think about, and certainly happy to talk through any issues or answer any questions.
Well, great. Thanks, Faith. I appreciate it. That was very insightful. And Mary, appreciate it as well. Guys, give me 1 second here while I just go through a couple of these questions, and I will ask those to you here in a minute. So one question, will the slides be available after the webinar? I did mean to mention that up front. Yes, absolutely. We'll make copies available of the deck. You just can send us an email. We can get it to you through PHRA as well. You'll get an email from PHRA after this with the code you need for CE. So you can just request that then, and we can definitely get that to you as well. Mary, there's a question around the slide here. If the question is basically, can you go into a little bit more depth about, give me a second here, the data that you're collecting and how you're using it here?
Yes. Okay, sure. So this is really kind of a future state, and the reason I put this on here is to just show you the impact of the whole trend on data analytics in this communication space. So in essence, once a company moves to a cloud-based unified communications tool, like what Fuse offers, you can actually track and look at whether it's people's phone calls, whether it's people's chats. You can use artificial intelligence to assess everything from the content of the messages of people's communication with respect to customers. There's all sorts of stuff you can do. This particular chart shows the volume and direction of communications between different offices. So this is actually our own. We did this data pull on our own company. And so what you can see is on the left-hand side, each little circle is a person. And on the left, you see the headquarters office. And you can see, and I believe this is for engineering, but it could be broader than that. You can see we've got engineering folks in Portugal, in Canada, in Amsterdam, in New York, in San Francisco. And then I think there's some folks that are just remote and not working in a particular office. But, based on this, one of the things that you observe is, not a lot of action or activity coming from Amsterdam to and from the other offices. And frankly, a lot of interaction between Canada, which is Ottawa, Canada, and the headquarters location. And so if I showed you another example, it would maybe be more illustrative. If you do this by person, you can oftentimes see when somebody is just totally overloaded. So you're just looking for patterns of, patterns of communication to try to discern, what you might do in terms of an intervention to help. So, for example, if you saw one office where there just wasn't much of anything happening, you might wonder, like, why is there not more activity there? If you see a lot of interaction between particular individuals, or you see one individual who just has everything's coming to that one person, you might say, wow, who are they? Are they, some sort of expert, or is there a reason why so many of those calls or texts are going to that one individual? So it really gives you a roadmap for trying to diagnose what's happening in your organization. And this isn't something that we have fully figured out yet, because there are very few organizations that actually collect this kind of communication data. It doesn't really exist in the old school platforms. It's really for those cloud communications companies that have everything pulled together under one umbrella.
Great, thank you. Second question is probably for both of you. Can you talk a little bit about communications plans that you've utilized in the past to roll out remote work policies?
So I can certainly speak to it at a high level. The company where I'm at now is tremendously flexible. We have work from anywhere policy that basically says you can work from anywhere. You literally could sit at the Starbucks. You could work at home. You could sit at your vacation home at your beach house or on a boat. And we actively promote people working from anywhere. Our policy, we don't reimburse people for their home internet usage. That's something that's been a request, but we feel like in today's day and age, unless there's a special circumstance where somebody is so remote that they can't get a decent internet connection, we just believe that that's part of how people work. Some departments actually have a little more structure around it. So, for example, if you work in our support organization, you could work from home. There's no problem about that. But you are on a particular time schedule because you're answering calls, you're answering text messages. And so for those folks, they have a little more structure around their remote work policy. But because our policy is really more of a philosophy, we don't have too much structure around it. So we don't say you can only work remotely one day a week. Obviously you have to work with your manager, and I think that's our policy specifically says you've got to make sure that you're completing your projects and that your manager is aware of where you're working, and you have to attend all of the normal meetings that you would be asked to attend, and your performance has to continue to be excellent. But outside of that, we haven't put too much structure around it because it's more of a philosophy than it is a policy.
And Faith, can you talk to that a little bit as well? I know you mentioned in your part of the presentation around the labor posters and communicating that. Can you talk a little bit about how an employer would think about that? From Mary's example, where the philosophy is you can literally work from anywhere. How do you still roll that out and do that, and then still meet the requirements that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. Yeah, as long as, for the posters specifically, as long as the employee is receiving and we can prove that he or she received a copy of the notice, which a lot of them are online, and you can send the PDF via email or put it up on your intranet and then have them make sure they're clicking on it, then it's okay. You don't have to actually have them physically sent to their home office. But that's only if they don't even go to the home office where there are posters very often. So if they come in once a week, I would argue that you don't have to send the posters separately because they are still getting access to them at least relatively frequently. I don't know if that helps, but that's what I would do. I would make sure that they get an email with the copy of it, or we have some way of showing that they physically received the notice.
Perfect. And then, Mary, there was a question around recruitment advantages. You had mentioned that you found that this was giving you a recruitment advantage as far as building up a pipeline of potential employees. The question is just, can you talk a little bit more about where you're seeing that most frequently? Is that around younger employees or older employees or specific types of programmers or accountants? Where are you seeing that the most?
It's everybody. I mean, it's every demographic. It's every generation. It's every global. It's every country around the globe where we have employees. It's universal. The flexibility and the work from anywhere is universal. I haven't seen one place where it isn't asked for, requested, where, you know, people don't bring it up as something that they value in our work environment. Now, having said that, we're a kind of a high-tech employer, so we have a broad range of diverse employees, but probably not a lot of baby boomers. We have some, but not a lot. So that's the group that we're appealing to. We're also in some really, really tough markets in terms of hiring, or big urban centers like San Jose, out in Silicon Valley, New York City, Boston, where the unemployment rate is in essence zero. So if you want to get programmers, if you want to get developers and engineers, or even people in your support organization, we have leveraged it to really make our company stand out. Women, particularly women who are childbearing age, really like it. I would also say people who are close to retirement, who may be doing more of a phased thing, or who are caught up with aging parents, also really benefit from the flexibility. So we've promoted this as a work from anywhere benefit, and we get a lot of positive push on whether it's Glassdoor or our own website from being as flexible as we are. And we actively promote it in terms of just showcasing and highlighting people working from anywhere. Like our CFO was on a boat on, I don't know, it was sometime in the middle of the summer, and he Instagrammed out a photo of himself on his cell phone taking a call while he had a fishing rod in one hand, and he was taking this call. Now, some people might say, well, you're going on a vacation. Why are you working? But I think the point is if he didn't have work from anywhere, he probably wouldn't be able to get that vacation. He'd be sitting in the office trying to do that same call. So we've really leveraged it across the board, and I think that's the other beauty of it. It really works for people that have all different kinds of diverse needs, and so it's been a very effective recruiting tool with almost every population.
Good deal. Faith, another question here. It says, I like the idea of it being a philosophy, but what do you do when someone is abusing the situation? Faith, can you take that one and kind of address what are the remedies that an employer has in the event that they feel they've got a remote worker who's abusing or not as productive as they need to be?
Yeah, I would recommend we go through, just like we would with any employee, a progressive counseling, if it even makes sense to do progressive, maybe, warning, especially if there's some objective way to show that, look, the productivity's down, the numbers are down, or there's some other measured behavior that we can tell the employee is not doing what he or she needs to do, then maybe after a warning, if it's still not working, we say, look, you're not going to be able to work remotely anymore, but just because we need to make sure that you are productive here. So, again, it's as long as we've got the policies in place and that we're documenting the issues and that they're objective and, there can't be some other protected reason that they're going to point to that we're singling this person out, but it's really the issue. That's what I would do is discipline and or even revoke the privilege of working from home. And again, I don't know what the situation is. I mean, because I would recommend if it's just a few that are working from home that we have a specific memorandum of understanding of the parameters. And even in that, we would say that, this is a exception. We're allowing you to work from home. It's not our typical policy, but we also have the discretion and the sole discretion to revoke that privilege and have you continue to come back to the home office. So those are a few thoughts.
I would also add that part of the challenge with this remote work is that you have to change how you manage people, and it doesn't lend itself to work that has to all be done in the same location. I mean, if you're working in a manufacturing setting and you all have to be together, you can't have a remote work. But what I would say is that for those organizations that allow it, you have to think about having a goal and measurement-based way of holding people accountable for producing work, because you can't see them. You can't just walk down the hall, go in their office, or go to their desk and ask, how are you doing on this? And so it does require changing a management style and putting in accountability tools that can really help you to, at a glance, see how people are doing.
Perfect. Totally agree. Totally agree with that, Mary. Someone just mentioned about asking if they can get a recording of this. I am attempting to record this through WebEx. Assuming it works appropriately, I'd be happy to share it with you. Just shoot me an email. My email address is at the end of the presentation here. You can also get in touch with me through PHRA. But that also kind of brings up the next question around how to introduce this into a culture that this doesn't exist right now. So where you've got a very formal, traditional culture that just no one's been, the leadership has not been able to get their head around remote working. Can you guys talk a little bit about that and how you introduce this into the culture?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I would look at who do you have that are early adopters of change at the executive level. So I would think about it just like you would any change initiative. And that's the first step. The CEO has to be bought into it. You have to get the buy-in at the top. I think having the right tools really does help. So if you have a tool like Fuse that enables the kind of flexibility, taking a look at those tools and talking to other companies that have implemented something similar will help you. And I always recommend that you do a small pilot to work the kinks out of the system. So I would take a small team or a super high-performing team and start with it there. I definitely think you can leverage also this notion that the workforce is changing, and most organizations have talent shortages. I don't know any HR person that isn't trying to find the right people or upgrade their skills or have a high-performing organization. And so if you want to attract the best and brightest, and particularly if you're looking for that next level of talent with the millennials, it's almost becoming table stakes that you have to offer this. So I think there's probably some recruitment and retention drivers that you could speak to in terms of a burning platform for change. But I would roll it out in small steps, and I would find, maybe there's one department where there's a lot of buy-in for it. I would provide manager training on how to shift the way people are being managed, because it also requires you to do your team meetings differently. So I think I would start small. I would get executive sponsorship, hopefully from the CEO, do a pilot, train managers, and lean on those companies that have already implemented it to work the kinks out.
Perfect. And I've got another question that says, would you say the philosophy is more about work produced rather than hours worked? And
yes.
I would say absolutely. Developing key performance indicators Yeah, it's a
results-based culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it just comes down to developing the appropriate KPIs and sitting down and clearly explaining that to all your employees, regardless of where they physically may be, and then developing the right feedback and communication loops with them to make sure you're staying on top of it as time goes on to manage to those KPIs.
I think it's interesting too, now that I've been in this workplace 2 years, and we have unlimited vacation, we have casual dress every day. It's extremely flexible. I cannot imagine ever taking another job where somebody says you have to be into work at a certain time or you can't work from home. I don't think I would even look at that. It has become something for me that would be a complete driver of my decision about where I want to go to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's incredibly important, as you mentioned, Mary, from a recruitment standpoint, to be able to recruit and retain the type of talent you need to function in this economy.
Yeah, I would echo Mary. I mean, flexibility has been my number one best thing for working with Dinsmore, because I can do the things I need to do, but not with an 8 to 5 type of mindset. It's very much kind of whenever. Now, of course, the downside is that there's certainly times where, I'm up at, 11 o'clock talking to somebody about something, which is fine. I'd rather have that than have set hours where I have to be and there's FaceTime rules. That's certainly not the way it is here, at least in labor and employment.
Well, and I think what's also happening, as you have just one other quick point, as you have a more globally dispersed workforce, which is becoming increasingly more and more common, you do end up, the boundaries around work are shifting. So when you have everything on your smartphone, you might take your afternoon off to go watch your kid's soccer game, and during intermission, you're checking and you're responding, and then you might have a call with Australia at 11 o'clock at night. Or you come in early in the morning, you're getting calls from Europe. So if you're in a globally dispersed workplace, you how you're working is already really different.
Yeah, that's another excellent point. Excellent point, Mary. Appreciate it. Well, guys, I've really enjoyed this session. I think this was great insight. Faith, I really appreciate your time, Mary, as well. Appreciate everything you guys have had to offer here. We're coming right up on 3 o'clock, so I hope everyone enjoyed this webinar today. If you'd like a copy of the slides or a copy of the presentation, feel free to give me an email, and I'll be happy to get it to you. Everyone have a happy holiday, and appreciate the time. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Mary.